Welcome back to Big Brave Business. I'm your host, Sarah K. Heater. Big Brave Business is a podcast where we challenge the status quo of traditional business practices. So if you're ready to challenge norms, rewrite the rules, and redefine what it means to lead with courage and integrity, then grab a notebook and let's dive in. Welcome back to Big Brave Business. My guest today is Alenka. With over 15 years working in the software space, Alenka has spent her career in a male-dominant space, often being the only woman in the room and the youngest. She's currently building her own business after going through health issues where she wasn't able to find answers in conventional medicine. Welcome, Alenka.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm so excited to be here.
I am definitely looking forward to this conversation because talking about being the only woman in the room is something that I really wanted to discuss on this podcast anyway. Like when I first sat down and was thinking about what are we going to talk about in season 2? What are some of the themes? What are some of the things? This was definitely on my mind. And when we first connected and started talking about what we could talk about, we really specifically wanted to dissect burnout and how burnout affects women differently from men. I feel like people talk about burnout all the time, so I don't necessarily want to spend time on what is burnout? What does burnout look like? Because I think generally speaking, like kind of the more sort of surface level answers we already know. And so I'm making that assumption. But I guess let's just start at the beginning. Like why do you think this conversation even needs to be gendered?
Because women are generally people pleasers. I think that's where it starts, and it dives into a lot more from there. I think I agree with you. Like burnout can look different to a lot of people. Learn it, what that means for yourself. But I think from a gendered perspective, I don't know about you, but I was brought up in an environment where women made sure everybody was okay in the room. And that could have looked like making sure somebody had a glass of water as a host, making sure like someone's emotional state was okay. If you were in a gathering and somebody was uncomfortable, you would go soothe them. In family dynamics, that happens as well, where at least for me, I was the eldest daughter. And if somebody's unhappy, you do what you need to do to make them okay. And that works to a point. But it really starts to blow up when it's over. Like for me, it was over a decade in a work environment where people take advantage of you and push you too hard. And I think that's where, like, you see it in work environments all the time, where women are not only doing their job, but they are also the ones organizing social events. They're also the ones like making sure that they're taking notes in a meeting. They're the ones getting food for people. If they're the only ones doing all of that, and that adds up, that's like a full-time assistant position often, or like volunteering on ERGs, or it's gonna wear on you, even if it's well-intended, even if you're trying to do it comes from a good place. And it also goes to, we're bad at saying no because that would be considered, I don't know, a nice way of putting this, because we can't say no the same way men can say no.
Yeah.
Because we can come across as not likable if we put that boundary in and say, hey, I have this many hours this week. This is what I can do. You're asking me to do more than that. And that can come across. I literally had a conversation with someone and he was like, oh, you can't do what I do. And I'm like, no, you're a man. I can't do what you do. And he's, let me see how I can support you with that. It's been a couple weeks and we've gotten nowhere, but like the intention was there. But what I'm saying is we aren't socially treated the same way. We cannot get away with the same behaviors and mannerisms. And therefore it is a gendered conversation.
Yeah, that's exactly how I was going to sum it up too. So society expects something different from specifically women. And so far, this conversation also has been very gender binary, right? Obviously, there's a lot more layer and nuance in the gender conversation than just like how men and women are treated.
Mm-hmm.
I think that I was going to go down a whole side tangent about that, but I think specifically talking to the experience of women, because that is what our lived experience has been.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that also, so that obviously we can speak to our own personal experience best, but I think also I feel like in a traditional work environment, regardless of your gender identity or your sex assigned at birth or anything along those lines, I think generally speaking in traditional work environments, you are perceived and categorized into two categories. And so acknowledging that there's a lot of different walks of life that people are on. I think one of the great gender struggles in the workplace is that you are categorized into one of two categories. I think that I just want to take a moment to acknowledge that. And then also, I want to come back around. One of the first things that you said was that women tend to be people pleasers. And as you were then exploring that a little bit, I found myself thinking about this, and I want to know what your thoughts are. I'm not sure what mine are, which is, what is the difference between people pleasing and being a natural caretaker, or the assumption that you're going to be in a caretaker role?
I think your distinction of assumption is great too, because there's always, you see this in social circles where there is the assumption that certain people are going to take care of the young kids, or that certain
Mhm.
people are going to be preparing the food, right? And those are the generally the same people who are assumed to be the caretakers, right? Is what you were saying. I think it's very fuzzy because there's a ton of overlap, right, between people pleasing and
Mhm.
caretaker. I would say that people pleasing often comes at the expense of yourself and your identity, whereas caretaking doesn't necessarily need to. It can, obviously. It definitely can, because you're taking care of someone that is their needs are greater than your own, and that can come at an expense of your own needs, right? But it's you are taking care of them. You are not making sure they are the happiest versions of themselves constantly and sacrificing yourself,
Mhm.
right? Like it's a little bit, there's a nuance difference there.
I could see that. I think too, as I'm processing this and listening to you, I'm thinking that maybe, okay, so so there's three layers here, like being in a caretaker role, which can look like an official caretaker role or an unofficial caretaker role. And when I'm talking about caretaking here, I'm talking about even to the point of being an office manager, right? Like that, or even a secretary or taking the minutes or whatever. Like that is caretaking in that sense. So sometimes that's an official role and sometimes that's an unofficial role. Then there's the layer of there's an assumption that if you're categorized into the category in a traditional work environment of woman, it's expected that you're going to be doing the caretaking things. Probably a woman is making the coffee. Probably a woman is throwing out the like food that's gone bad in the break room refrigerator. Probably a woman is ordering office supplies. Probably a woman is taking notes. Probably a woman is ordering the food for the meeting that's coming up, including if she's also an executive, but if she's the only female executive in the room, then it's expected that she's going to be the one who would handle that. Or there's probably a formal like secretary or office manager or something who's probably also a woman who that would be tasked with that. So I think there's then that layer of assumption. And then I feel like the layer of people pleasing is when we are categorized into that category in a traditional work environment of you fall into this category of woman. So therefore, with the assumption that you're going to be a caretaker, we also have an internal assumption that this is our responsibility. And yes, I think you're right, sometimes to the detriment of ourselves. But even if it doesn't necessarily feel like a detriment in the moment, like cleaning out the food that went bad in the break room refrigerator benefits me too. I just don't want it there. So like something that simple doesn't necessarily feel detrimental in the moment, but being the person who does it and making that assumption on your own that you are the one who does that actually then perpetuates the stereotype that's your role. So I'm really fascinated by kind of these different layers of caretaking, the assumption of caretaking from other people, the assumption of caretaking within yourself. And then, of course, yes, like putting people before you, where, yeah. And I think those kind of do add up together because, like I said, if you're taking actions that are perpetuating the stereotype or the expectation, then that is detrimental because how you're perceived then is as, I'm going to use the term less, even though that's crazy to think that
Mhm.
somebody who's taking care of things is actually less. That seems like it should be more, in my opinion, but it is perceived as essentially you're the help that's beneath me, but you'll handle it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's that's the I have a whole nother I grew up my mom my parents are immigrants and my dad was a plumber. And so I would have people make comments of, oh, your dad only does this or whatever. And I just find and I would always be like best friends with the janitors and like whatever, because like that, like I would always stay late at school too, like that was part of it. But like also, I don't think it's ever okay to assign value to someone based on their position in society. Um,
Yeah, and it's a really weird feeling that the people that we would hire to support us, that we would look down on those people when they, and I use the word they in this case because somebody that you hire to support you, so not yourself, so an external person, that's where I was coming from with they are actually like someone to look up to and appreciate because you couldn't do it without them.
Yeah, and I think someone gave me this really a good analogy that I like appreciate a lot because I also worked in college as a receptionist for an eye doctor, and is this concept of the doctor could probably do a better job at the like receptionist position theoretically, right? But they can't do as good of a job at the thing that they are really good at, which is being a doctor, right? This goes for any position. Like there was a book I was reading is what is your genius? What is the thing you are really good at? And you can't be really good at that without the support of that staff, of those people. Because it's going to take away from your ability, you just even time, energy, whatever it is. And so you're right. We should be lifting these people up and we should be like so grateful because ultimately they don't have to be there. And they also don't have to do it to the level that they are doing it at. If they don't feel appreciated, they probably won't. Cause like I don't, when I don't feel appreciated, like we all do the bare
Yeah.
minimum when we're not appreciated. And when we are,
Yeah.
we do a lot more, right? Like, there's some basic human psychology here, which I think goes back to the burnout because I see this in so many environments where people just want to squeeze out as much as they can get out of a person and they aren't treated well. Like I had a really abusive boss and I couldn't get a day off for a medical procedure because they were trying to squeeze and squeeze and squeeze. And I know other people have this experience as well where they can't get those and we're not treating people as humans. We're not treating them as, oh, you have other things going on in your life. And like we expect people to act like machines too. I know I'm going on a totally different tangent, but
It's good.
we expect people's output to be the same as if you left like a computer running a software and it's constantly doing its thing and like eventually overheat, but it has a similar output. Humans aren't like that. We have cycles in our life. We have like highs and lows. Like people talk about winter being like a time where you can chill and relax and then you have more energy at certain times, right? Like that it is important that we give ourselves that break. You can talk about hormonal phases, you can talk about life phases, whatever. But like the idea that we're squeezing every last bit of energy out of a human until they are burnt out or quit or whatever, we're starting to see it more commonly in culture where people are like, I'm not going to be doing this anymore. And I'd rather do gig work or I'd rather do like something else because it's not worth it for me.
I think I talked about this on this podcast before, and I hate this because where I saw it, it didn't have a source cited, and I then have repeated it, and I don't have a source to cite, so it could just be total bullshit. But I heard that on another podcast or something that in the next 5 years, more than half of the economy is going to be gig economy based. That is the way that people are going. And I feel like this about what I call entrepreneurship, which I would say could be like any online business, like turning to online business for either supplemental income or to ultimately leave the like kind of rat race. I honestly feel like as a millennial, this is the better option for us. When we came out of school, there were no jobs that really required college education available. So we wound up working either really, again, like what's considered a lower level job. And a lot of times we ended up with working multiple lower level jobs, multiple hourly jobs, multiple service oriented jobs, multiple secretarial positions, things like that, in order to afford our life, including our student loan payments that we now couldn't use that education. And then as things have opened up as far as like job opportunities for millennials, I feel that we end up being really lumped in very often with Gen Z, who are 10 to 15 years younger, and we're treated like we're the same age and the same level of experience. And that is really frustrating to feel like often there are peers, people who are considered peers of ours, who are 10 to 15 years younger than us, and sometimes who get promoted before us because at the time that we entered the job market, there were no jobs available. That is, like, to me, a very frustrating element of being a millennial, just the timing of everything. And so I feel like millennials, and again, I don't have like data for this, but I feel like millennials turning to either supplemental income through entrepreneurship or turning to entrepreneurship overall
Mhm.
is the direction that our generation is forced to go in order to have kids, buy houses, have an adulthood, please.
Yeah.
Like at 40, ready, we're ready to have those things. So it's just really interesting, I think, to consider exactly what you said of the reasons why people turn to entrepreneurship, which is hardly a way to avoid burnout. That's not going to prevent burnout. But what's so interesting is I have found myself saying, whenever people talk about like how hard entrepreneurship is, if you think entrepreneurship is harder than having a quote unquote 9 to 5, a corporate job, you haven't worked a corporate job in a long time.
Yeah.
That is really hard. It's really hard. And so I guess what I'm coming back around to is, what makes having a corporate job so hard and draining?
So many things. I think it also depends. I will say it really does depend on the corporation, right? And the company culture and all of that. And it's hard to evaluate that before you start the job, especially if you don't
Totally.
know anyone at the company who works there already or anyone who will give you an honest opinion of what it's like, because that's a whole nother thing. I think it's a few things. So we were sold, to your point, this illusion of stability in working a corporate job. And having that stability will give you retirement, will give you time for vacation, will give you health insurance, yada, yada. We can talk about like the tech layoffs that happened last year. And those are like great high paying jobs and stable jobs and all of the jobs everybody wanted. And now I'm seeing this turn where I got somebody messaging me from like an Apple recruiter recently. And they're like, no, no, no. And I'm like, did you look at my experience? This is no, there is no way I would accept this. And it's a contract position. Why would I give up my full time for a contract position? And this goes back to these, right? Where like all of these big companies are realizing that they can get less for like less pay and they'll make a lot more money. Experience or whatever is separate, but because someone gets a name on the resume, and then people are going to burn out and move on. And I'm seeing like the flip side. I have a friend in Santa Barbara, and one of those big FANG companies is trying to establish an office there, and they reached out to him and were like, hey, like we want like a contract position. I have a really cushy job. He makes great money. It's like, why would I quit my cushy job that gives me like, he was like, oh, if the surf's good, people don't show up to the office till noon. Like, it's one of those, like, they work hard, but they also play hard. Like, they enjoy their life. It's like, why would I give that up for working for a company that's going to squeeze the life out of me? And it's a contract position. And so I'm hoping there's a shift. I'm hoping, I know I can dream big, but like that there's
Yeah.
starting to be like a shift that people are able to say, hey, I am not going to do what you want me to do if you don't respect me as a human, if you don't treat me well.
Yeah.
And you can start to see it in small doses. Obviously, it's going to take a lot more. So I think that's part of it. I think that's part of what squeezes you. But then it's also in America, and I'm originally Canadian, so I can speak to this on a different level. Health insurance and not having it, and that terrifying, especially if you have a family to support and not having
Yep.
that is, I've seen people do so many things that they wouldn't do if that wasn't the motivating factor.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely agree. And I think that is interesting too, because I think that's true for all people. And I think that's true for all people with families, especially. But I think it's most true for, again, women. I think that there's an ingrained socialization for men to be more comfortable with taking risk, and women as the kind of caretakers going behind them, somebody has to be concerned about the risk taking.
Yeah.
And I think you could even go back all the way to the socialization. And I can't remember if I've talked about this on this podcast before or not, because I also have a podcast for Girl Scout troop leaders, and so we talk a lot about gendered conversations over there. So can't quite remember what's been talked about on which podcast at this point, but you can go all the way back to the socialization of when we're small children or even toddlers, and how we're socialized that girl children are less encouraged to take
Mhm.
risks. And even with the way toys are made and built. It like literally teaches boys how to take risks, how to take things apart and put them back together. And girls are not taught to be comfortable with the dismantling of things. So to then grow into adults who have to make choices and assess risk, I think women assessing risk is, I think, also a contributing factor to why burnout affects women specifically differently, because I think the constant risk assessment
Mhm.
is something that, I mean, I think disproportionately affects women.
Yeah, and I think because the risk assessment is taking into account uncertainty, right? And when you think about when you're trying to manage uncertainty, that's when anxiety comes up, the joys. And then we become this anxious mess because we're constantly trying to account for this unknown and that unknown and like the things that we ultimately can't control, but we're doing our best to do it. And that anxiety wears on us. We were talking before we started recording about like certain situations increasing blood pressure. And there
Mhm,
I'm
yeah.
starting to learn, and it's so fascinating. And we can talk about, for example, when you're stressed, like how many of us are wearing mouth guards and how many of us grind our teeth and how we hold stress in different parts of our body, like tight shoulders,
Mm,
tight glutes. I have a hamstring I hold on to. And right now I'm like, okay, let's
mm,
relax it. But like we start to internalize it in our bodies. And then we go to the doctor because like I ruined my teeth. I went to the dentist and I'm like, there must be something wrong. She's, no, you just ground your teeth so hard that you're
mm,
in extreme pain. And we see this in different ways. And everyone has a different thing about it. But men tend to be more allowed to get frustrated and to release that stress and that anxiety. Women tend to hold on to it and internalize it a lot more. Like
mm,
I personally was in a horrible situation in my early 20s. I got ovarian cysts from it.
mm,
I have a friend who was in a really toxic work
mm,
situation. She was diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. She puffed up her everything. Her joints were a mess. She ended up quitting that job. It disappeared. She was in a different work environment. You see this when you start to talk to people about their certain relationship situations, work situations. When they get out of it, hopefully they do, we see these things disappear. But if we don't, which I didn't, it until my body shut down, our body can force us to move on, whatever that looks like. My body was like, we're not writing emails anymore. We are not functioning. Like you need to get out.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting that you say that. I wanna comment on that specifically for my own experience, and then I wanna come back to something that you said at the like, earlier on, but for me, my reproductive cycle has been, like, fucked since I started getting one. Since I started having one, it was always a disaster, and then when I started my business, it wasn't immediate, but, like, within 6 months of going to full-time working from home for myself,
Mhm.
I started seeing the most regular cycle I've ever experienced. And I seriously thought, okay, it could be that your hormones change. What is it? What do they say? Like your entire cell structure
Yeah.
changes every 7 years or something. So it could be hormonally as I've aged, like it could be a coincidence, but I don't think so. And it's not that simple. Obviously, I still have my own kind of health stuff going on. It's not like now I'm a perfectly healthy person. I am not pretending that. I have talked about some of the stuff that I've experienced or gone through a little bit on this podcast before. So I'm not trying to say that, but it is interesting that it is the most consistent cycle. It's not perfect, but it's the most
Mhm.
consistent cycle I've literally ever had since I went into entrepreneurship. And then the other thing I wanted to mention about the whole risk assessment thing too is that I want to go ahead and also take this opportunity to specifically talk about like non-men
Mhm.
because and we could even go a cisgender heteronormative white man specifically
Mhm.
has the most opportunity to take big risks, and every other person, every other identity of person has different degrees and layers and intersectionalities to which risk assessment looks different because risk literally equals danger. And
Yeah.
if you're a less safe person to exist in the world, then that means that you have definitely a risk aversion. And not to say, oh, so we just need to help those people take risks. No, it's literally like a life saving measure
Yeah.
that we don't take risks. No, literally, if you are not a white, cisgender, heteronormative man, then you have to be aware. I saw on an account I follow for an account creator who specifically creates content about being non-binary and what the kind of lived experiences are for people who are non-binary or gender fluid. They were talking about how when they pull into a parking lot to go somewhere, they look around at the bumper stickers on the cars to assess their level of safety before they exit their vehicle. Yeah. And that is just one example of, and again, that's just pulling one example out of the air, especially because we're talking about gender in this conversation, to say to a certain degree, I think that women can relate to that feeling, even if it's not the exact same experience, where, you mentioned in your bio about being the only woman in the room. There is a level of threat that you have learned for the sake of survival to expect, anticipate, be prepared for, and what you can do to try to protect yourself. And to a certain degree, you can't protect yourself, but not being the only one in the room is actually like already a big way to significantly increase your safety. And I bring this up because I think when we talk about bearing the load, the mental load of risk assessment, I think that this is super gender related and other intersectionality conversations as well. Of course, like race is a huge part of that. But I think that when we talk about burnout, we can look at the intersection of those things even more so and say that women of color are experiencing also a disproportionate experience with burnout compared to white women, compared to, again, cisgender heteronormative white men. Like there's different levels of this and different layers and nuance in this. But I think that specifically looking at the gender conversation, that risk assessment mental load, I think largely comes from the way we carry that in all of our experiences. And that includes work.
Yeah. Like I think about, I have a very specific wardrobe that I wore to that toxic job to like avoid being objectified. Because then I literally had someone once tell me, "Oh, I didn't know you were smart," coming out of a meeting. Or like I was eating at my desk and I had cooked my lunch. "Oh, I didn't know you could cook." But like in a very pointed, "I can't believe that you are a multifaceted human being." And so I think about all of these groups that you're talking about, and that it starts from the beginning of your day. What you wear when you go into these environments with other people who don't have your same lived experience. How do you carry yourself? How are you changing your voice to be more, and your tone of voice and the way you speak and all of that to be more digestible, if you will, to that other group, right? The group that doesn't have your same or similar lived experience. When you are constantly having to change what is authentically you to accommodate for the world around you, it wears on you. Like we can all relate to that in some level.
And I think, I want to like really expand on that and say not just the things that you can or can't change about yourself. I think sometimes we change what we can to try to mask some of these other things, but it's also, yes, for sure, your race, but also your skin color, which obviously there's different layers there. Your hair color is part of that, of how you're perceived, makeup, your weight, your boob size, your butt size, like all of these things. It sucks that as women, when we walk into a work environment, we have to think about that. Like it sucks. My hair color, maybe I can change. Of course I can change. I have changed it. But like my boob size, like they just grew. Like what the heck am I supposed to do? Or they didn't, right? Depending on what your body looks like. And with weight too, it's like how thinking about those things. And I don't think men have to deal with that at least to the same degree, not remotely to the same degree. And so again, I think, this whole thing about perception and appearance, I think is a huge part of women's burnout and how we aren't just burnt out because we work hard. I think that's really like the summary of this is that we're also doing all of the caretaking. We're also constantly assessing our risk. We're also extremely burnt out by the pressures of appearance and like our physical traits. Yeah, that's interesting. You had mentioned, I don't know if it was after we started recording or before we started recording, but you had a long list. What else is on your list?
A long list of what type of list? Because I think we talked about like 3.
Oh, yeah. Okay, true. Ways burnout is uniquely different for women than men.
So as we're talking about, I think you're right, like the working hard, but I'm also thinking of like the saying no. And we talked about it a little bit, but I think that because we can talk about it. I don't want to get into politics, but you talk about the likability of certain political figures and how much less likable they are just if they are not a man. And it's a societal thing, and we all have our own thoughts in our head, and we all try to unlearn how we speak to ourselves and how we speak about other people, even in our own heads. It doesn't have to be verbalized. And I think part of all of that is to be said is like, when you are a woman, if you are likable, you are more successful, generally speaking. And saying no can often make you less likable. But if you don't say no, you push yourself harder and more than you should.
That's so interesting, and I'm gonna say, yes, that's definitely true, and also, it actually is detrimental both ways, and we're constantly walking the line. If you're likable, you're dumb, right? You're
Mhm,
perceived as dumb, which is so interesting because you mentioned earlier, someone said, "I didn't know you were smart." If you are focused on being likable and a caretaker, you are not perceived as being smart. If you are focused on being in control and asserting yourself and demonstrating your knowledge,
mhm,
then you're overly assertive, you're domineering, you're a bitch, right? And then you're not likable. People don't like you, they don't want to work with you, they don't want to work for you, and they talk shit about you. Like either way, and you I
yeah,
feel like as women you really have to walk this line of balancing being competent and being likable
mhm,
at all times that again, I don't think men have to do. Probably likability is still a factor, I
right,
think, for men in a unique their own way,
mhm,
but I think it's different. And I don't think that correlation of likability to your
mhm.
competence exists for men.
Yeah, you just reminded me, and I don't wanna, butcher it, but that monologue that in the Barbie movie about
Yeah.
like, it's exactly that, like, "You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't," like,
Yeah.
and so many people, I think she spent 3 months writing it or something. I remember, like,
Yeah.
reading interviews about it before the movie came out, but, like,
So good.
it was such it hits so viscerally because it is so
Yes.
true, like, no
Yeah.
matter what we do, we can't get it right.
Right. Mhm.
And it's easier for other people with other experiences to do that. And there are tiers of, like, certain people with certain experiences have it easier than others, for sure, but
Mhm.
you're
Mhm.
right, I think women are just it's you're constantly balancing and toting that line, and especially as you get farther up in an organization, there's politics, and if you can't navigate
Yeah.
politics, you're not gonna get promoted. And that's
Yeah.
just so if the right person doesn't like you and the right person this has happened so many times to me, sorry, listen,
Mm.
the right person might not like you because you called them out on their shit, excuse my French,
Yeah.
in front of other people, and it could have been in a very nice way. You could have said it
Yep.
in the most articulate, the most politically correct way and said, "Hey, did we consider this or did we consider that?" Not putting the blame on any one person, but we all know that the one person made the mistake and do it in a nice way. And you can try to approach it even beforehand, right? There's plenty of ways to play this game, but you can rub someone the wrong way because you said the smart thing. And then
Right.
because you said the smart thing and that automatically made their thing not as valid, but
Yeah.
it was still the right thing for the organization, it can
Right.
put you in a position where you're not promoted, where you're not moved forward. And that's infuriating.
Yeah. I when you started that and you said, "This has happened to me so many times." I actually had this thought that you were gonna go in the direction of if you've rejected that person, and I was initially thinking it meaning it as if they wanted to cross a line and you rejected that advance, but actually I think really at the heart of it, it's the same thing, that bruised ego of yeah, that can be a big part of it. So, I'm watching the time and I feel like there's so much more that we could talk about, but really what I wanna wrap the conversation up with is so what? Okay, so we understand that there are gender
Mhm.
differences to burnout, but like, why is this conversation important? I don't know. What do you think? Why is this a conversation you wanted to have?
For a lot of reasons. So, like, I'm building my company because of the experiences I've gone through and, like, how I didn't find answers in healthcare. And I'm also, of the belief that, like, I do see hope in the younger generation. You were talking about we're compared to Gen Zs, millennials. And yes, absolutely true. But also, they don't put up with shit the same way we have and the same way Gen Xers
It's true.
have, right? And so
Yeah.
I'm starting to see small shifts in the workplace where they're like, we're not willing to deal with that and we're not willing to deal with this, that, and the other thing. And I'm hoping this means that there will start to be a shift in leadership. The fact that we're talking about mental health, that we're talking about burnout in general in public spaces,
Mm.
and we're able to do something about it by even talking about it, right? That's a start. We all know
Mhm.
it's not the be all end all, but it moves things forward. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, doesn't mean it's going to necessarily help us in the next 5 years. Who knows, right? But it also means that, to me, the people that have successful businesses, and there's a lot of, again, we could talk about this for ages, there's a lot of psychology and interesting things behind it, are the people who treat humans as humans. The long-term businesses, the people who retain employees, who have like sustainable revenue, and there's other pieces to this as well, obviously, but they tend to have that thread of treating people well and being transparent and being honest instead of hiding information, and then all of a sudden there's
Mhm.
a layoff. And I think we're starting to see a little bit more of a shift in that transparency, and what I want to build for my team is a very different way of looking at it, because I've seen what others have done and it hasn't worked. And so, to your risk taking point, what do we have to lose? Yeah, a lot. But also, it's like, for me, every time I make a decision in my business, now it's, is my mission stronger than my fear of doing the thing? And that has to, for me,
Mhm.
be the underlying, like, is what I believe and what I am doing stronger than the fear of not doing it? And that for me meant last year standing up for myself with a toxic boss. And it was terrifying, but it's worth it.
Is my mission stronger than my fear? Wow. Okay. That's going to stick with me. That's big. Okay. Yeah, I love that. I think you're so right. And I think for me, reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, I hope that if you're listening and you do not identify as a cisgender heteronormative white man, that you feel a little less alone, that you feel a little like validated
Yeah.
in what your lived experiences have been. I hope that you feel a little less alone, that it's not you. And also, I think when we know better, we can change it. I think you're right about that. I think it's like the only way to break the cycles is to talk about them. And a lot of that, I know a lot of the people who, I think the people who listen to this are primarily entrepreneurs, but I think that whether you're in entrepreneurship or if you are in leadership and business in general, I think also the opportunity to do things differently in your own leadership is also like a big part of this discussion, and like having the awareness and the context and having these conversations continuously. It's not like anything we talked about is stuff we didn't already know, right? But talking about it still matters because it brings it to the forefront of the way that we make decisions and the way that we operate in our own leadership. So yeah, I think for me, a big part of running my building my company too, right? Like
Mhm.
kind of you insinuated this, is I'm constantly assessing what kind of leader do I want to be? What are the core values of my company? How am I growing my team? How is my team being supported? How are we navigating all things like human resources on my team, but also my clients too, right? Like how am I supporting clients, and how does this factor into my client support? How does this factor into my offers? How does this factor into my pricing? How does this factor into my hiring strategies? How does this, all of these
Mhm.
things, having these conversations continuously keeps that at the front of mind as you're making those decisions. And so I think constantly reminding ourselves we don't have to do things the way they've always been done. And here's why the way things have always been done sucks. So hopefully, yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think we have the opportunity to do something about it,
Mhm,
right?
mhm.
Like, we are lucky enough in many ways, right? Like, I didn't choose to be born with the skin color I have, or in the location in the world that so what can I do with the privilege I have to help other people?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, really well said. That's great. I love to wrap up all of these conversations with the same question because we are multifaceted people and it can be work related, but it doesn't have to be. So, what is something that is bringing you joy or making you happy right now?
Like, presently, in the moment, hearing my dog snore on
Or
the
like
couch.
usually, oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Usually, or in the past, I guess I should say, what Amanda and I used to do in season 1 is we would do what's something that's been making you happy this week.
Mhm.
But that in the context of this is funny because we didn't talk last week. So that, okay, it could be last week. Also because I'm recording 2 of these back to back today. So for me to say what's making you happy this week, it's different weeks that it's going to air. So anyways, it doesn't matter. But just in general, these days, what's something that's making you happy?
Yeah, I think this might be more related to your audience than my dog story. Oh my God.
I like that
Yeah, it's a good
one.
one. I only started doing podcasts 2 weeks ago to help promote my business and what I'm doing and to become more comfortable public speaking, et cetera. Before that, and even the first week, I had so much anxiety before going and, like, recording something and
Mm,
even being like, I don't love getting my photo taken. I don't love speaking at a camera. The
mhm,
changes that have happened in those 2 weeks, and
mm,
I just feel so much more
mhm.
comfortable and relaxed and
Yeah.
less stressed out, and it makes me so happy because it's like, "Oh my goodness, I did something and I've grown as a human being." Like, it's just I try to, like, relish in the small things that I think it's big, but, like, it's in those small, moments of self-improvement.
I love that. I'm so thrilled for you, and as a podcast producer and strategic consultant, like, helping people incorporate audio content into their marketing strategy, like, my heart could not be happier to hear that progress that you see in yourself and, like, you being proud of yourself and putting yourself out there. That is so cool. Okay, that's a really good one. So mine is on a recent episode that aired before this one, I talked about getting a new car. This past weekend, I got it, and it is making me so happy. It's, like, far and away the nicest fucking car I have ever had, and yeah, I'm pinching myself. Yesterday, Eric and I just took it for a drive, and of course, at the time that this airs, like, this was a few weeks ago, but we took it for a drive and just went out into I'm in Arizona, so we went out into the desert, and it's beautiful, and we had the freedom of getting out of the city traffic and just it's like a pinch me moment. And when I was driving back from the dealership, I said, I feel like for me, there's so much measurement of progress from starting my business and growing my business and seeing that, to your point about growth, seeing your personal growth, like this wouldn't have been possible for me before I started my business 5 years ago. And I can even say 3 years ago, which is when I got my last car. This wouldn't have been possible for me then. And this is like loving this vehicle so much and having this vehicle that I like have dreamed of. This is something I deserve. And driving in it and feeling like this feels like me, this feels true to me. And I'm empowered to be able to pursue that. This is the quote unquote beginning, and it's not the beginning, but it's the beginning of me having the things and the lifestyle that I work my ass off to have, like that I want and I dream of. And it just feels like it represents so much more than just a car.
Mhm.
And I think in entrepreneurship, that is, and just business leadership in general, but I think in entrepreneurship, especially, being able to measure your progress in things like that, in things, I don't know, it's real. And I'm not like, fucking posting on Instagram with my Lamborghini or my private jet or whatever, like that. We're so not at that status, but my Honda, I feel really good about it. And yeah, I just love it so much and I'm happy. That's bringing me a lot of joy. The buying a car process, not so much, but now that I have it, it's bringing me joy. Thank you so much for being here, Alenka. And if you want to connect with either of us, of course, our links will be in the description of the episode. But definitely so thrilled to have connected with you. And I feel like there's just a million more topics and directions we could go. So obviously, would love to have you back. That's something that we've been talking about with a couple of guests, I think. I would love to talk more about age because you also mentioned being the youngest one in the room, and that's something that we didn't really even touch on.
Yeah.
So I think that would be really interesting. And I'm trying to do this where if people can continuously come back,
Mhm.
then it's a familiar voice. So I used to have a co-host, so that was the same two voices every time. And this time for season 2 with a different voice each week, I think being able to have, even if it's a rotating voice, being able to have the consistency of, this is a person I know I liked and I've already learned so much about them from this previous episode. So now I think that would be a good vibe. So I'd love to have you back. And thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate you. And to you listening, thank you so much for being here. I will see you next week.